Karen adjusted her designer scarf as she stepped onto the plane, glancing around with a satisfied smile. Today was her lucky day, or so she thought. She had been upgraded to first class due to overbooking in economy, a perk she felt she deserved after years of enduring cramped seats and lackluster service. As she made her way down the narrow aisle, clutching her leather tote bag, she couldn't help but feel a sense of superiority wash over her. First class wasn't just about comfort. It was a status symbol, and Karen reveled in it. Her eyes scanned the luxurious cabin, taking in the plush seats, crisp white linens, and sparkling glassware waiting to be filled with champagne. Everything seemed perfect, until she reached her assigned seat. Sitting by the window was a young man who looked completely out of place. He wore a simple hoodie, jeans that were slightly faded, and sneakers that showed signs of wear. His backpack, resting at his feet, looked like something you'd find in a college dorm room, rather than on an international flight. Karen froze for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. This couldn't be right. Someone like him didn't belong here. Her gaze flicked between him and her ticket, confirming she was indeed in the correct seat. With a deep sigh, she forced a tight smile and slid into the space beside him. The young man barely glanced up from his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. Karen settled into her seat, trying to ignore him, but her mind raced with judgments. Who was this guy? How had he ended up in first class? Surely he hadn't paid for it himself. Maybe he'd won some contest or gotten a handout from someone else. Whatever the case, he clearly didn't fit in with the polished businessmen and well-dressed travelers surrounding them. As the flight attendants began their pre-flight preparations, Karen's irritation grew. She noticed how casually the young man slouched in his seat, one leg crossed over the other, as if he owned the place. His hood was still up, partially obscuring his face, and his posture screamed indifference. Meanwhile, Karen sat ramrod straight, adjusting her scarf again for effect. She wanted to make it clear that she belonged here, not him. The final straw came when the flight attendant offered them both glasses of sparkling water. Karen accepted hers graciously, holding the delicate glass by its stem like a seasoned traveler. The young man, however, simply took his without ceremony and placed it on the tray table without even a thank you. Karen rolled her eyes discreetly, shaking her head ever so slightly. Clearly, he had no idea how things worked in first class. By now, her annoyance had bubbled over into outright disdain. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Leaning closer to him, she cleared her throat loudly enough to get his attention. When he finally looked up, his expression was calm, almost disinterested. For a brief second, Karen hesitated, but only for a second. Summoning her most condescending tone, she said, "You know, people like you don't usually belong here." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. The young man raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Karen smirked, leaning back in her seat as though delivering a verdict. "Oh, come on," she said dismissively. "Look at you. This isn't exactly your scene, is it?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. Karen expected him to squirm under her scrutiny, to apologize or explain himself, but instead, he gave her a small, enigmatic smile before turning back to his phone. That reaction, or lack thereof, only fueled her frustration. Little did she know, the man sitting beside her was far more than he appeared to be. And soon, Karen would learn a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. Karen's comment lingered in the air like a bad smell, but the young man, Alex, didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he simply nodded slightly, as if acknowledging her words without giving them much weight. He turned his attention back to his phone, scrolling through what looked like an email or document. To Karen, this was infuriating. How could he act so nonchalant after being called out? Didn't he care that she thought he didn't belong here? The flight attendants moved efficiently around the cabin, handing out menus and offering warm towels to first-class passengers. Karen accepted hers with a practiced smile, making sure to thank the attendant warmly. She glanced sideways at Alex, who also received his towel, but barely acknowledged it, placing it on his tray table without so much as a nod to the attendant. Unbelievable, Karen muttered under her breath, rolling her eyes. Her irritation wasn't just about the hoodie or the sneakers anymore. It was about his attitude. Everything about him seemed wrong, from the way he slouched in his seat to the fact that he hadn't even cracked open the menu yet. Meanwhile, Karen had already decided on the smoked salmon appetizer and was debating between the filet mignon and the lobster for her main course. As the plane taxied down the runway, Karen couldn't resist another jab. "You know," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "first class isn't exactly where you'd expect someone like you to end up. Maybe you got lucky." She punctuated her sentence with a smug grin, clearly enjoying herself now. Alex finally looked up again, meeting her gaze directly. His expression was calm, almost amused. "Maybe I did get lucky," he replied evenly, his tone neither defensive nor confrontational. "Or maybe I earned my spot here." Karen scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Earned it? Please, let me guess. You won some raffle or got upgraded by mistake." Alex shrugged, unbothered. "Something like that." His indifference only made Karen angrier. She leaned closer, lowering her voice but keeping it sharp. "Look, I'm not trying to be rude, but let's be honest. You stick out like a sore thumb here. This is a place for people who appreciate quality, who work hard for things like this." She gestured vaguely around the cabin, as if the leather seats and polished surfaces were proof of her point. For a split second, Alex's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "Fair enough," he said quietly. Then, without another word, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a paperback book. With deliberate calm, he opened it and began reading, effectively shutting down the conversation. Karen sat back in her seat, fuming. What was wrong with this guy? Most people would have been embarrassed, or at least tried to defend themselves. But Alex acted like none of it mattered. It was maddening. Her frustration grew as the minutes ticked by. The safety demonstration started, with flight attendants demonstrating oxygen masks and emergency exits. Karen noticed that Alex didn't pay much attention to it, flipping casually through his book instead. "Of course," she muttered sarcastically, loud enough for him to hear. "People like you probably think rules don't apply anyway." Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension brewing between the two. A middle-aged man across the aisle exchanged a quick glance with his wife, silently agreeing to stay out of it. Even the flight attendants seemed to pick up on the vibe, avoiding eye contact as they passed by. When the plane finally lifted off the ground, Karen crossed her arms tightly over her chest, refusing to look at Alex. She told herself she was done engaging with him. He wasn't worth her time. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was off. There was an ease to his demeanor, a quiet confidence that didn't match his casual appearance. And while Karen prided herself on judging people accurately, there was a nagging doubt in the back of her mind. Little did she know, Alex's presence on this flight wasn't random, and his role was far more important than she could ever imagine. For now, though, Karen remained blissfully unaware, stewing in her own judgments and waiting for the turbulence ahead, not just in the skies, but in her assumptions as well. The flight had been smooth for the first 20 minutes, but just as Karen was starting to relax and flip through the in-flight magazine, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. It wasn't severe, just enough to make the cabin shudder slightly and rattle the silverware on the tray tables, but it was enough to unsettle some passengers. A few gasps rippled through the first-class cabin as people instinctively grabbed their armrests or tightened their seatbelts. Karen gripped her armrest with both hands, her knuckles turning white. She hated turbulence. It always made her feel like she'd lost control, which was ironic since she prided herself on being someone who thrived on control in every other aspect of her life. Her eyes darted around nervously, searching for reassurance that everything was fine. Most passengers were calm, either chatting quietly or scrolling on their phones, pretending the bumps weren't bothering them. But then Karen noticed Alex. He hadn't moved an inch, not even when the plane dipped sharply, causing a collective murmur of unease among the travelers. His book was still open in his lap, though he wasn't reading anymore. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his posture relaxed, one hand resting loosely on the armrest. He looked completely unfazed, as if turbulence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. This only fueled Karen's irritation further. How could he be so calm? Didn't he realize they were thousands of feet in the air, hurtling through clouds at hundreds of miles per hour? She stared at him incredulously, shaking her head. Finally, unable to contain herself, she leaned toward him again. "Seriously," she snapped, her voice sharp despite the rumble of the plane. "How are you so relaxed right now? Maybe this is exactly why people like you shouldn't fly first class. You clearly don't know what's going on." Alex turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. There was no trace of annoyance or defensiveness in his expression, just quiet confidence. "Trust me," he said calmly, his voice steady over the hum of the engines. "I know exactly what's going on." His words sent a chill down Karen's spine, though she couldn't quite explain why. Was he mocking her, or was there something else behind his tone? Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. For a moment, she felt a flicker of doubt, but she quickly brushed it aside. "Oh, please," she retorted, rolling her eyes. "What could you possibly know about flying? You're just sitting there like it's no big deal while the rest of us are trying not to freak out." Alex didn't respond immediately. Instead, he closed his book gently and placed it on the empty seat beside him. Then, without saying another word, he glanced out the window, watching as the wing of the plane bobbed slightly in the wind. His silence was infuriating. Karen wanted him to react, to defend himself or argue back, but he seemed entirely uninterested in engaging with her. The turbulence began to subside after a few minutes, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, assuring everyone that they were passing through a small weather system and would soon return to smoother skies. Passengers visibly relaxed, loosening their grips on their armrests and resuming their conversations. But Karen remained tense, her mind racing. She couldn't stop thinking about Alex's cryptic response. "I know exactly what's going on." What did that mean? Was he just trying to sound mysterious, or was there more to him than met the eye? The thought gnawed at her, planting seeds of uncertainty in her otherwise steadfast judgments. As the plane steadied and the fasten seatbelt sign blinked off, Karen tried to shake off her unease. She told herself she was overthinking things, that Alex was probably just pretending to be cool under pressure because he didn't want to admit he was scared too. Still, she couldn't help stealing glances at him whenever she thought he wasn't looking. Each time she found him sitting quietly, his demeanor unchanged, as if nothing unusual had happened. It wasn't until later, when a commotion broke out near the rear of the plane, that Karen's doubts grew even stronger. Shouts echoed faintly from the economy section, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps in the aisle. The flight attendants exchanged worried glances before rushing toward the source of the disturbance. Karen watched all of this unfold with growing anxiety, her earlier bravado slipping away. She glanced at Alex again, expecting to see concern, or at least curiosity, on his face. But once again, he appeared completely unperturbed. In fact, he seemed almost prepared. That's when it hit her. Maybe Alex wasn't just some random passenger who didn't belong in first class. Maybe he was something, or someone, else entirely. The commotion at the back of the plane grew louder, drawing everyone's attention. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening, and whispers began to ripple through the cabin. From where Karen sat, she could hear raised voices, angry, frustrated tones that carried a sense of urgency. Something wasn't right. A man from the economy section had apparently gotten into an argument with a flight attendant over seating arrangements. He claimed he'd been promised an upgrade but was forced to stay in coach, and his frustration had escalated quickly. Now he was standing in the aisle, gesturing wildly and refusing to sit down despite repeated requests from the crew. The tension was palpable, even in first class. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier bravado fading as unease settled in. She glanced toward Alex again, half expecting him to look concerned, or at least curious, about the escalating situation. But instead, he remained calm, almost eerily so. His eyes scanned the scene methodically, taking in every detail without betraying any emotion. It was as if he were assessing the situation rather than reacting to it. "This is ridiculous," Karen muttered under her breath, shaking her head. "People like that ruin everything. Why can't they just behave themselves?" Alex didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. For the first time since boarding, he seemed fully engaged, not with Karen, but with what was unfolding around them. Then, without warning, he stood up. Karen blinked in surprise. "What are you doing?" she asked sharply, her voice tinged with irritation. "You're not seriously going to get involved in this, are you?" Alex glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "Someone has to," he said simply before stepping into the aisle and heading toward the disturbance. Karen stared after him, dumbfounded. What kind of person willingly inserted themselves into chaos like this? She watched as he moved calmly down the aisle, weaving past rows of curious passengers who turned their heads to follow his progress. When he reached the economy section, he paused for a moment, speaking quietly to one of the flight attendants. Whatever he said seemed to reassure her. She nodded firmly and stepped aside, allowing him to approach the agitated passenger. From her vantage point in first class, Karen couldn't hear exactly what was being said, but she could tell Alex wasn't confrontational. His body language was relaxed, his movements deliberate and measured. He spoke softly, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. Slowly but surely, the shouting subsided, replaced by quieter, more controlled dialogue. After a few minutes, the disruptive passenger reluctantly returned to his seat, still grumbling but no longer causing a scene. As Alex made his way back to first class, several passengers whispered among themselves, clearly impressed by how effectively he'd handled the situation. One elderly woman patted his arm gratefully as he passed, thanking him for stepping in. A businessman gave him a respectful nod, murmuring something about professionalism. When Alex finally returned to his seat beside Karen, she stared at him incredulously. "What was that all about?" she demanded, her tone laced with disbelief. "Who are you?" He settled back into his seat, unfazed by her scrutiny. "Just someone trying to help," he replied casually, as if breaking up mid-air arguments was an everyday occurrence. Karen opened her mouth to respond but stopped short when she noticed the flight attendant who had been assisting earlier discreetly approach Alex. She leaned in close, whispering something that sounded suspiciously like gratitude. Then, to Karen's astonishment, the attendant added, "Thank you for your service, sir." Service? Karen's mind raced. What did that mean? Was Alex some kind of professional troubleshooter? A security expert? Or was there something else entirely going on here? Before she could ask, Alex turned to face her, his expression neutral. "Like I said earlier," he reminded her gently, "I know exactly what's going on." This time, Karen didn't roll her eyes or scoff. Instead, she felt a flicker of doubt creep into her thoughts. Maybe, just maybe, she'd underestimated him. And as the remainder of the flight stretched ahead, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that there was far more to Alex than his hoodie and sneakers suggested. The rest of the flight passed in a strange haze for Karen. She couldn't stop replaying the incident in her mind, dissecting every detail about Alex's behavior. The way he'd calmly stepped into the chaos, diffused the situation, and earned the gratitude of both passengers and crew. It all seemed too calculated, too practiced to be coincidence. And then there was that cryptic comment from the flight attendant. "Thank you for your service." What did it mean? Who exactly was this man sitting beside her? Karen glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, trying to piece together clues. He appeared completely unfazed by everything that had happened, flipping idly through his book as if nothing unusual had occurred. His calm demeanor only deepened her unease. Most people would have basked in the attention or bragged about their role in resolving the disturbance, but Alex didn't seem interested in any of that. In fact, he almost looked bored. Her curiosity reached a boiling point when another passenger, a well-dressed businessman 2 rows ahead, leaned back in his seat and called out to Alex. "Hey, weren't you on that news segment last year?" The man asked casually. "About air travel safety." Karen's head whipped around so fast, she nearly gave herself whiplash. News segment. Air travel safety. What on earth was this guy talking about? Alex glanced up briefly, offering a polite smile. "Could be," he said noncommittally, clearly not eager to elaborate. But the businessman wasn't deterred. "Yeah, I remember now." The man continued enthusiastically. "You're one of those federal marshals, right? The ones who fly undercover to keep flights safe." The words hit Karen like a thunderclap. A federal air marshal. That explained everything. The calm under pressure, the subtle confidence, the ability to handle conflict with ease. Her stomach churned as realization dawned. All this time, she'd been judging him based on his hoodie and sneakers, dismissing him as someone who didn't belong in first class. Meanwhile, he'd been quietly ensuring everyone's safety, including hers. For once, Karen was utterly speechless. She felt heat rising to her cheeks as embarrassment washed over her. How could she have been so wrong? So blind. The smug comments she'd made earlier, the condescending remarks about how people like you didn't belong in first class, now sounded hollow and cruel even in her own mind. As whispers spread among the other first-class passengers, Karen noticed a shift in how they treated Alex. People who had previously ignored him now greeted him warmly, nodding respectfully or thanking him for stepping in earlier. Even the flight attendants seemed to go out of their way to check on him, offering refills of his drink and asking if there was anything else they could do to make his flight more comfortable. It was clear that everyone now saw him in a different light, including Karen. But while others were quick to show appreciation, Karen found herself frozen in place, unsure of what to say or do. Every instinct told her to apologize, to acknowledge her mistake, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she possibly explain herself without sounding defensive or insincere? Instead, she sat stiffly in her seat, clutching the armrests as if they might anchor her to reality. When the plane finally began its descent, the captain came over the intercom to thank everyone for flying and to remind them to gather their belongings. Passengers started unbuckling their seatbelts and pulling luggage from overhead compartments, chatting animatedly about their plans upon landing. Karen, however, remained rooted in her seat, her mind racing. She watched as Alex stood up, slipping his book back into his backpack with practiced efficiency. For a moment, she thought he might leave without saying another word to her, but then he paused, turning slightly to meet her gaze. "You know," he said softly, his tone neither accusatory nor mocking, "judging people before you really know them can lead to some pretty big misunderstandings." His words hung in the air between them, simple yet piercing. Karen swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his steady gaze. I didn't realize," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Alex studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slightly, accepting her apology without fanfare. "It happens," he said simply before turning away and walking down the aisle toward the exit. As Karen sat there, watching him disappear into the crowd of disembarking passengers, she felt a wave of shame, and something else too. Resolve. Maybe this experience could teach her something valuable, not just about others, but about herself. After all, life had a funny way of showing you exactly what you needed to learn, whether you wanted to hear it or not. Weeks passed, but Karen couldn't shake the memory of that flight. It replayed in her mind like a movie on repeat, the judgmental words she'd spat out so carelessly, Alex's calm demeanor despite her rudeness, and the humbling moment when she realized just how wrong she'd been. At first, she tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just one awkward encounter on a single flight. But the more she thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the sting of her own behavior. For the first time in years, Karen found herself reflecting on her actions, not just toward Alex, but toward others in her life. She had always prided herself on being direct and confident, but now she wondered if those traits masked something uglier, a tendency to judge people too quickly, to make assumptions based on appearances rather than substance. The thought unsettled her. Was she really the person who dismissed someone because they didn't fit into her idea of first-class material? Determined to change, Karen decided to take action. She began volunteering at a local community center, working alongside people from all walks of life, people she might have overlooked or judged unfairly in the past. At first, it felt uncomfortable. She wasn't used to stepping outside her carefully curated bubble, and some days she struggled not to fall back into old habits. But as she spent more time listening to their stories and learning about their lives, something shifted inside her. Slowly but surely, she started seeing people differently, not through the lens of stereotypes or snap judgments, but as individuals with unique experiences and perspectives. One day, while boarding another flight for a business trip, Karen froze mid-step as she spotted a familiar face near the gate. It was Alex. He stood casually by the counter, scrolling through his phone, looking much the same as he had weeks earlier, hoodie, sneakers, and all. For a moment, Karen considered turning around and pretending she hadn't seen him. Facing him again felt daunting, even embarrassing. But then she remembered the resolve she'd felt after that flight, the decision to be better, to do better. Taking a deep breath, she approached him. "Alex," she said hesitantly, her voice trembling slightly. When he looked up, there was no flicker of recognition at first. Then his eyes narrowed slightly, and understanding dawned. "Karen," he said evenly, his tone polite but guarded. I wanted to say something," she continued, fumbling over her words, "about what happened on our last flight. I owed you an apology." Alex raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "An apology?" "Yes," Karen admitted, her cheeks flushing red. "I was rude to you, judgmental. I assumed things about you that weren't true, and I'm sorry for that. You handled everything with such grace, even my comments, and I didn't deserve that kindness." There was a pause as Alex studied her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "But let me ask you something. Why does it matter so much where someone belongs? On a plane, in a job, in life. People are more than what they look like on the surface." His words struck a chord deep within Karen. They were simple yet profound, forcing her to confront the root of her biases. "You're right," she said quietly. "It doesn't matter. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how quick I am to judge, how blind I can be to the bigger picture. I don't want to be that person anymore." Alex gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Good," he said. "That's a start." As they boarded the plane together, Karen felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She knew this wouldn't magically erase her past mistakes or instantly transform her into a perfect human being, but it was a step forward, a step toward becoming someone who saw beyond appearances, who valued people for who they truly were rather than what she assumed them to be. And as the plane soared into the sky, Karen glanced out the window, feeling oddly hopeful. Life had given her a second chance to learn and grow, and she wasn't going to waste it. Karen's newfound perspective didn't stop at that conversation with Alex. Over the following months, she made a conscious effort to carry those lessons into every aspect of her life. The flight had been a turning point, a moment when she realized how small her worldview had become and how much richer it could be if she opened herself up to others. It wasn't always easy. Old habits die hard, and there were days when she caught herself slipping back into judgmental thoughts. But each time, she reminded herself of Alex's calm confidence and his simple yet powerful advice. Asterisk people are more than what they look like on the surface. Asterisk. At work, Karen began paying closer attention to her colleagues. She'd always assumed she knew who was competent and who wasn't based on their titles or appearances. But now she challenged herself to see beyond those labels. One day, during a team meeting, a junior employee named Mia presented an idea that seemed unconventional at first glance. In the past, Karen might have dismissed it outright, but this time she listened carefully and was pleasantly surprised by its brilliance. By the end of the presentation, Karen found herself applauding Mia's creativity, realizing how close she'd come to missing out on something valuable simply because of her biases. Her volunteer work at the community center also deepened her understanding of people. She met individuals from backgrounds so different from hers that she couldn't help but marvel at their resilience and resourcefulness. There was Jamal, a former mechanic turned artist, whose sculptures told stories of struggle and hope. And Elena, a single mother juggling 3 jobs while pursuing her degree in nursing. Each interaction broadened Karen's horizons, teaching her that everyone carries unseen burdens and untapped potential. One evening, as Karen sat at home reflecting on these changes, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from her company announcing a new diversity initiative aimed at fostering inclusivity in the workplace. Normally, Karen might have skimmed over such messages, assuming they weren't relevant to her role. But this time, she read it thoroughly and volunteered to lead one of the workshops. The workshop brought together employees from all levels of the organization, encouraging them to share their experiences and perspectives. At first, some participants were hesitant, unsure of how honest they could be. But Karen's sincerity broke the ice. Drawing on her own journey, she shared the story of her encounter with Alex, not just the embarrassing parts, but the lessons she learned about humility, empathy, and growth. Her vulnerability resonated with the group, sparking meaningful conversations that carried over long after the session ended. Months later, Karen received an unexpected message via LinkedIn. It was from Alex. His tone was friendly, almost casual, as he thanked her for sharing her story publicly. "I'm glad you took something positive away from our encounter," he wrote. "It's not often I get updates like that." Karen smiled as she read his note, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. She replied warmly, expressing gratitude for the role he played, unknowingly, in helping her grow. Though they never spoke again after that exchange, the connection lingered in Karen's mind as a reminder of how even brief encounters can leave lasting impressions. Looking back, Karen marveled at how much had changed since that turbulent flight. What started as a moment of embarrassment had blossomed into a journey of self-discovery and transformation. She no longer saw herself as someone entitled to judge where others belonged. Instead, she embraced the idea that everyone has value, regardless of outward appearances. As she boarded yet another plane months later, Karen scanned the cabin with a smile, appreciating the diversity of passengers around her. Some wore suits, others jeans, and a few even sported hoodies. But none of it mattered anymore. Not to her. Life, she realized, was like a mosaic. Beautiful not because every piece looked the same, but because each fragment added depth and color to the whole. And as the plane soared into the clouds, Karen leaned back in her seat, content in the knowledge that she was finally part of the bigger picture and grateful for the lessons that had helped her find her place within it.